Okay, this is the tissues chapter. There are 8 parts to this. Again, I kind of broken them down into small bit-sized pieces. So let's just get started. First, the study of tissues, just as a refresher here. The study of tissues is called histology. So that's what we're really going to be taking a look at, is this histology. The definition of tissues, a group of cells similar in structure and function. And for the human, everything can be broken down into 4 tissue types. We have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve. And so then the organization of this chapter is pretty straightforward. We're going to start with epithelial, go over characteristics, types, then do the same thing for these 3 other tissue types. All right, so we're going to get started with the epithelial tissue. And just some general features of epithelial tissue is that we're going to find it lining a body surface or a cavity. And that's really going to be important because that's going to tell us certain characteristics that we see with epithelial tissue. The other thing with ET, or epithelial tissue, is that we're going to see it as a lining epithelium or as glandular. So we are going to cover this, but we're going to do so kind of briefly, because in 169 we go over the endocrine system. So we will just be talking more about the structure of glands. All right, so now what we have are the characteristics. So when you take a look at a tissue and you're trying to determine what tissue it is, most of the time, if you see a slide that is jam-packed full of nothing but cells, then that most likely is going to be epithelial tissue. And there are, of course, some exceptions, and you'll get used to them as you start to go through. Now, because they're jam-packed full of cells, what we're going to see is that there's going to be special contacts. Tight junctions and desmosomes are typically what we see. All right, polarity. Apical and basal surfaces. I'm going to skip this just for a second. So what we see here for this one is that deep to all epithelial tissue is connective tissue. And where those two meet, where the epithelial tissue and the connective tissue deep to it meets, that is called the basement membrane. And that basement membrane is made up of 2 parts, a reticular lamina and a basal lamina. All right, the reticular lamina is secreted by the connective tissue, and the basal lamina is produced by the epithelial tissue. And so we see that deep to all epithelial tissue is connective tissue. So what that means then is that at that junction, an epithelial cell will always be in contact with this basal lamina, this part of the basement membrane. That part of the epithelial tissue, that cell, has a basal surface. So all epithelial tissue has this basal surface, and that's just where a cell is in contact with that basement membrane. Now, if you also remember, features of epithelial tissue were that they're found lining a surface or a body cavity. So that also means that there's always going to be a free surface. And this apical is going to be that free surface. And so what polarity means here, this is different than what we were talking about in chemistry. In chemistry, polarity just meant it had a charge. Here, what that is telling us is that if we have a multi-layered epithelial tissue, the cells at the basal surface are going to differ in appearance as opposed to the cells in the apical surface. Okay, so as we go from that basal surface, that attached surface to the basement membrane, the cells down there are going to look different than the cells as we continue to move towards that free surface. Once we get to that apical surface, the cells that make up that apical surface, they're going to look different. And that's what polarity means. Avascular but innervated. Avascular means that there's no blood vessels. All right, vascular means it has a blood supply. Avascular means it does not have a blood supply. So then how does epithelial tissue get the nutrients and oxygen it needs that is found in blood? From the connective tissue. Right? That is one of the functions of this basement membrane, is to act as a sieve and to let nutrients, if here's my epithelial tissue and here's my connective tissue, blood is going to be in this connective tissue, and the nutrients is just simply going to diffuse across that basement membrane. Innervated means that it has nerve fibers. Now, since epithelial tissue is also found lining a body cavity or a surface, it's going to be subjected to a lot of wear and tear. So the mitotic index of epithelial tissue typically is going to be high. Mitotic index just means that it goes through the cell cycle quickly. Okay? So these are the characteristics. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use some of this information and move forward and talk about classification. So for the classification of most, not all, but most epithelial tissue, it is a named classification system. The first is how many layers. If it has one layer, it is simple. Two or more, it'll be stratified. And I'm going to come back to this slide. All right, so that's the first part. The second part then is the shape of the cell. Squamous is going to be flattened, cuboidal is cube-shaped, and columnar is column-shaped. Another thing of note is that most of the time the nuclei will conform to the shape of the cell. So a squamous cell will have a flattened nucleus. Cuboidal, of course, is not going to have a cubed nucleus, but it'll be a perfect circle. And columnar will have a column-shaped nucleus. There is one exception. We can have some simple columnar where the nucleus is a perfect circle. But it is so far towards that basal surface that it is obvious that it is a column-shaped cell. So, first name tells us how many layers. Second part tells us the shape. Now I just want to go back for a second. If we remembered polarity, the cells at the apical surface differ from the cells in the basal surface. So when we're taking a look at a stratified, a stratified epithelial tissue, down here these almost look cuboidal. Here they look squamous. And so how do we make the determination? And we always go based on the cells, how they look in that apical surface. So for a stratified epithelial tissue, the shape of the cell at the apical surface is what we need, what we use to complete the second part of that classification of that nomenclature. Okay? All right, and that is it for part one.